When we talk about the British Empire, we often speak about kings and queens, armies and admirals, governments and governors. But empires are not built only by rulers. They are also built by ordinary people. Factory workers in smoky London streets. Sailors on crowded docks. Mothers reading newspapers at breakfast. Students reciting lessons from classroom maps marked in bright red. For more than 2 centuries, millions of ordinary Britons formed opinions about the empire not from battlefields, but from headlines, stories, victories, and silence. This is the story of how everyday people saw the empire that shaped their world. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for joining this journey into the past. Today, we explore how ordinary citizens of Britain viewed the rise and fall of empire. Not from the perspective of leaders, but from the homes, streets, schools, and workplaces of everyday life. Their ideas were shaped by pride, fear, hope, and sometimes by doubt. Some believed the empire was a force of progress. Others wondered what price was being paid overseas. Do you think ordinary Britons truly understood what was happening in the empire, or did they only see the version the government and newspapers wanted them to see? They were told of glorious conquests and the bringing of civilization to the heathen lands, but what of the atrocities committed along the way? The politicians and industrialists, who stood to gain from the empire's expansion, were the ones who controlled the narrative, and the people were left in the dark. But there were those who spoke out against the empire's brutal suppression of native cultures and the exploitation of its resources. They were the unseen heroes, who risked everything to expose the truth and bring about change. In the early 18th century, Britain stood at the edge of change. Most people living on the island had never traveled farther than the nearest market town. Their world was local, shaped by fields, workshops, and the rhythm of everyday life. Beyond the coastline, distant seas and unfamiliar continents existed more in imagination than understanding. Yet whispers of something larger drifted through streets and gathering places. Ships returned with tales of distant ports. Sailors carried news of victories and losses. Traders spoke of opportunity. For many Britons, these early impressions formed the first outline of empire. News traveled slowly. Letters crossed oceans on fragile vessels, arriving months after events had taken place. Rumors often reached the island long before reliable reports did. In taverns, sailors described encounters in India, Africa, or the Caribbean. Coffeehouses became meeting places where merchants and scholars discussed trade routes and naval strategy. Newspapers repeated fragments of information, assembling stories from incomplete knowledge. What people learned was less a picture of the world as it was and more a reflection of hopes and expectations at home. Trade victories made headlines in London. Ships docking along the Thames brought goods that astonished the public. Spices, textiles, sugar, and tea arrived from places few could imagine. Merchants displayed samples of cargo in shop windows to excite buyers. These objects became symbols of a connection to somewhere far away. People saw them not as imports but as proof that their small island had begun to matter in a world much larger than they had known. Pride grew from the idea that Britannia's future might lie across the sea. In coffeehouses, the conversation turned competitive. Reports described France and Spain seeking influence abroad. The suggestion of rivals advancing created a sense of urgency. Patrons traced routes on crude maps, predicting where conflicts might unfold. Ordinary citizens followed these developments like a sport. Each new trading post in India or each newly secured harbor in the Caribbean became a point of celebration. Through stories and speculation, expansion began to feel like progress. For many, empire was first imagined as a promise rather than a responsibility. It represented strength in a world where nations struggled for position. It hinted at prosperity that might reach even those who had nothing to do with overseas ventures. Without seeing the consequences, people imagined a future defined by opportunity. Ships set sail, and the island watched them go with anticipation rather than concern. At home, the empire seemed distant and harmless, a story unfolding somewhere else. Parliament debated issues connected to overseas trade. Politicians argued over taxes, monopolies, and the authority of companies acting abroad. Few citizens understood the details, yet they sensed the stakes. Newspapers presented these debates as contests that shaped national destiny. Victories in policy felt like victories for the public. Slowly, overseas involvement stopped feeling like a temporary strategy and began to feel permanent. The idea of Britain as a world power settled into the public mind. People rarely questioned what life looked like on the other side of those victories. They heard of forts, markets, and alliances but not of the complexity behind them. Reports focused on Britannia's gain rather than the experiences of those living in the regions affected by it. In the absence of information, assumptions grew. Images formed from distance rather than detail. These impressions would later shape how empire was defended. Along ports and shipyards, the evidence of expansion was tangible. Workers loaded cannons and supplies for voyages that might last years. Families watched relatives depart, uncertain if they would return. Wandering through the docks, a person could sense that something irreversible was happening. Britain was no longer an island content with its shores. It was reaching out, making decisions that stretched across oceans. The horizon became a symbol of possibility. By the 1730s, some people began to sense complexity beneath the optimism. Occasional reports described failed negotiations or conflicts. Letters from abroad mentioned difficulty with governance or disputes among trading partners. These glimpses suggested that empire required more than celebration. It demanded management, diplomacy, and choices that carried consequences. Yet these warnings remained small shadows compared to the enthusiasm that filled newspapers and taverns. As goods flowed in and stories flowed out, the early empire became part of everyday imagination. Children grew up hearing about distant places as if they were chapters of a great adventure. Adults debated strategies for lands they had never visited. Identity expanded. The island began to see itself not only as a nation but as a rising presence on the world stage. People who once measured their lives by local boundaries started to think in global terms without ever leaving home. This period, from 1700 to 1760, was not defined by clear policy or organized ideology. It was defined by feeling. A feeling of pride. A feeling of movement. A sense that Britain was becoming something more than it had been. These first impressions did not describe empire accurately, but they helped build the foundation for it. They shaped expectations before structures existed. They influenced opinion before reality was understood. Pride arrived long before responsibility. As the century progressed, the world would grow closer. News would travel faster. Decisions made in one hemisphere would echo quickly in the other. The responsibilities of empire would begin to outweigh its promises. But in this earlier moment, Britain stood at the threshold, unaware of the scale of what it was entering. The impressions formed in this era would remain, guiding judgment even when the truth grew more complicated. Looking back, the beginning of empire was not defined by conquest or administration alone. In rumor. In curiosity. In ordinary lives that felt connected to distant places through stories rather than experience. First impressions are powerful. They shape how history is remembered. In the early 18th century, pride defined those impressions. And pride set the course for everything that followed. The Age of Coffeehouses and Stories 1760 to 1800. Between 1760 and 1800, a unique cultural shift unfolded across Britain. In cities, market towns, and busy ports, coffeehouses became gathering places where news and imagination blended. The scent of roasted beans mixed with ink from newspapers, and the damp coats of sailors who had just returned from sea. These rooms became stages where the story of the empire was told, shaped, and believed. They offered a space where ordinary people could feel close to distant lands they would never see, and where rumor, report, and ambition shared the same table. Merchants returning from India stepped inside carrying tales of spices, textiles, and fortunes made at the trading posts. Their stories painted visions of cities shimmering in heat, ports crowded with ships, and landscapes filled with unfamiliar plants and animals. They inspired listeners to imagine a world where opportunity seemed limitless, where oceans acted not as barriers but as pathways leading to personal advancement. In these conversations, the empire appeared not as a structure of control, but as a doorway to wonder. From the Americas came accounts spoken with equal confidence. Some described fertile plantations and new markets that promised wealth. Others spoke about forests, river networks, and the challenges of establishing settlements in lands that felt both exciting and uneasy. These narratives reassured Britons at home that expansion confirmed national strength. They rarely included the deeper complexities that came with it. The hardships, resistance, and suffering that underpinned these developments remained far from the popular imagination. Newspapers circulated among the tables, carrying printed stories of naval victories, expanding trade agreements, and political developments overseas. These pages celebrated British ships that secured sea routes and protected commerce. They praised admirals whose names became symbols of national pride. The narrative was simple. The empire succeeded because it deserved to. This message was repeated often enough that many readers accepted it without question. Confidence became a habit, reinforced day after day with each issue delivered from the press. Coffeehouses thrived on the energy of conversation. Debates rose and fell like tides. One group might analyze the latest parliamentary speech about trade. Another might argue over the details of a report from Bengal or Jamaica. For some, these discussions offered the illusion of participation in decisions made far away. Without ever leaving their hometowns, they felt connected to the machinery of global influence. They imagined themselves as part of a nation that acted with purpose on the world stage. Meanwhile, the reality of these overseas activities remained distant. The suffering caused by heavy taxation, forced labor systems, or the violent restructuring of local governance rarely entered these walls. Even when hints of hardship appeared, they were softened by phrases like necessary intervention or administrative reform. Listeners nodded, acknowledging the words without fully understanding what lay beneath them. It was easier to believe in progress than to consider the costs that progress demanded. The growing postal network and improvements in print technology meant that information spread faster than ever before. A report that once took months to arrive could now reach London in a matter of weeks. This speed intensified the sense that the empire was alive, in motion, and constantly expanding. Maps pinned to walls showed new territories shaded in red. Each update created a feeling that Britain stood at the center of the world. The coffeehouse audience did not always comprehend the complexities of this influence, but the emotional impact was powerful. This period also reshaped identity. Young men who had never traveled beyond their region imagined futures as clerks, soldiers, or officers in places they knew only from stories. Entrepreneurs considered investments in trade companies or new goods brought from abroad. The empire became intertwined with personal ambition. It was no longer an abstract idea. It was a ladder, a possibility, a direction. Even those who never climbed that ladder were shaped by the belief that they could. Artists and writers fueled this atmosphere by creating images and accounts that celebrated wonder. Paintings captured palm trees bending in tropical winds, ships anchored against scarlet sunsets, and markets rich with fabrics and color. Their work offered an edited view of empire, one that left little space for doubt. Viewers absorbed these impressions, and imagination replaced understanding. The world beyond Britain became a canvas on which confidence was drawn. Yet subtle uncertainties existed beneath the surface. Not everyone accepted these stories without hesitation. Some questioned the accuracy of the reports. Others wondered why so many tales spoke only of wealth and not of those who paid the cost for it. These questions did not define public conversation, but they lingered. They hinted at the debates that would grow in the next century, as the realities of administration, resistance, and reform became harder to ignore. By 1800, the age of coffeehouses had left a lasting mark on British society. It forged a culture of curiosity about the world. It allowed ordinary citizens to imagine themselves connected to global events. It built an emotional foundation for the belief that empire was not only strategic but natural. And it did so with stories that flowed faster than truth, stories that calmed uncertainty, and stories that taught people what to expect from the world long before they understood what the world expected in return. This was the age when confidence became a companion to everyday life. When information, filtered through conversation and print, shaped understanding more than experience did. When a cup of coffee and a newspaper could convince a reader that the empire moved forward with dignity and purpose. It was a time when curiosity expanded horizons, and silence about hardship preserved the illusion that progress belonged to everyone. The age of coffeehouses built the stage on which the modern empire stood. It offered stories that comforted, inspired, and united its audience. And in that blend of truth, omission, and imagination, the future of British identity began to take shape, one conversation at a time. The Industrial Era and Imperial Pride 1800 to 1830. In the early decades of the 19th century, Britain was changing at a pace the world had never seen before. The clatter of machinery filled the air of industrial towns. Steam engines powered factories that rose like monuments to a new age. Canals and rail lines cut across landscapes. And ships left crowded docks carrying goods to every corner of the globe. For many Britons, this transformation felt like the beginning of a modern destiny. It seemed as though the empire and industry were two forces moving in step, each reinforcing the strength of the other. Factories consumed raw materials from across the world. And that flow became part of everyday life. Cotton from India spun into cloth in northern mills. Sugar harvested in the Caribbean sweetened cups of tea. Tea itself arrived from Asia on ships that crossed oceans with the reliability of an industrial schedule. These goods appeared so regularly that they seemed ordinary, as familiar as bread or coal. But each product connected ordinary workers to distant lands they might never see. The empire became present in kitchens, in workplaces, and in the rhythm of the daily meal. For many workers, the empire felt like an engine that kept the factories running. They believed that raw materials supplied by colonial territories were essential. Without cotton, textile machines would fall silent. Without sugar, markets would shrink. Without global trade, wages and production might collapse. This belief created a sense of partnership, even if that partnership was not balanced. The empire supported industry, and industry justified empire. The two ideas intertwined until separating them seemed impossible. New technology encouraged this sense of connection. Steamships, mechanical looms, and faster printing presses compressed distance. News of distant events arrived with greater speed. People living in crowded industrial neighborhoods read about places far from their own. They learned of ports in India, plantations in the Caribbean, and trading centers in Asia. Even if they did not know the details, they understood the shape of the world as something tied to Britain's fortunes. The empire became not only a structure of power, but a framework of imagination. Yet there was a cost that many people within Britain did not see. The materials that fed the factories often came from systems that displaced communities or demanded strict forms of labor in colonial territories. These realities rarely reached the streets of Manchester or Birmingham. Instead, the industrial boom created pride. It suggested that Britain was leading the world into the future, and that the empire was proof of that leadership. Few questioned the imbalance because the benefits were visible. The harms were distant. Still, hints of complexity appeared in the edges of the conversation. Travelers spoke of regions where traditional ways of life were being disrupted. Some missionaries described conditions that raised ethical concerns. Reformers and early activists began asking how the wealth of industry was connected to decisions made overseas. Their voices were small compared to the roar of machinery. But they existed, marking the first cracks in a narrative that seemed solid. Inside the factories, workers often saw themselves as part of something larger. The long hours, the noise, and the harsh conditions of industrial labor were real. Yet the belief that Britain was rising on the world stage offered a sense of purpose. For many, it was easier to imagine change through progress than to imagine it by questioning the system itself. The empire became a source of identity. Even those who lived far from privilege felt that they belonged to a nation shaping the course of history. Streets filled with the signs of industrial prosperity. Warehouses, markets, and foundries extended into the horizon. Some saw this as evidence that Britain was chosen by circumstance or destiny to lead. The coal that fueled the engines became a symbol of national power. The smoke that drifted above factory roofs became a banner of progress. In this atmosphere, imperial pride became a natural sentiment. People did not need to be told to feel it. They absorbed it through their surroundings. Government officials and manufacturers reinforced the message. Public speeches and pamphlets described industry and empire as components of the same success. Expansion overseas was presented as a necessity to sustain economic growth. Economic growth, in turn, was presented as a benefit to everyone. As long as the factories thrived, Britain would remain stable. As long as raw materials arrived, the engines would continue to turn. Meanwhile, colonial subjects were mentioned in newspapers and letters, but their voices were rarely heard directly. Reports framed distant populations as partners or dependents, rarely as equals. The narrative implied that British systems were bringing improvement, that the colonies were gaining from the exchange. In industrial Britain, few questioned this story. It was easier to accept than to explore the truth beneath it. By the late 1820s, the connection between industrial power and imperial confidence was firmly established. People who had never left their hometowns felt linked to ports and plantations they could not name. They believed the empire was both the source and the proof of national identity. The machinery in the factories did not only shape cloth or metal. It shaped belief. The world beyond Britain was changing as well. Trade networks grew more complex. Competition increased. Some territories resisted imperial policies. But these tensions were not fully visible within the industrial centers. The empire seemed stable. The factories seemed unstoppable. Pride overcame doubt. By 1830, the industrial era had altered not only Britannia's economy, but its self-image. The nation saw itself as a modern giant, transforming the world with steam, metal, and enterprise. Empire was no longer just territory. It was identity, woven into the rhythm of production and consumption. The goods that passed through hands and households carried with them an invisible message. The empire was not distant. It lived in the texture of daily life. In this period, the industrial age and imperial pride walked hand in hand. One supplied the materials. The other supplied the meaning. Together, they reshaped how Britain saw itself and how it believed the world should be. The classroom of the mid-19th century was a quiet workshop of imagination. Between 1830 and 1870, generations of British children sat at wooden desks, slate boards in hand, while teachers unfolded a world far larger than the schoolroom walls. Lessons spoke of distant seas, unfamiliar landscapes, and territories marked in a confident shade of red. For many children, this was their first encounter with the idea of empire. Not on the deck of a ship or in the pages of a political speech, but on the flat surface of a map pinned to the wall. The map was more than geography. It was a story. Red lines traced coastlines, curved across deserts, and circled islands that few in the classroom would ever see. Teachers spoke with calm authority, describing these spaces as partners in a grand project. The empire was presented as a family of nations, with Britain at the center, offering guidance and stability. The idea settled into young minds gently, like chalk dust drifting through the air. The empire seemed natural, orderly, and permanent. Schoolbooks reinforced this view. Bound in sturdy covers and filled with neatly printed text, they described colonies as places lifted into progress by British influence. Lessons framed distant territories as participants in a shared civilizing mission. Complexities vanished in the margins. In their place, a polished portrait of cooperation took shape. The language used in these lessons softened reality. The word guidance replaced control. Partnership replaced authority. Influence replaced command. In stories and examples, Britain acted as a steady hand. The territories appeared as grateful recipients of progress. Even the geography of the map emphasized this. On these classroom walls, scale and distance bent into meaning. The British Isles sat like a lighthouse at the top of the page. Children absorbed these ideas long before they had the experience to question them. The empire entered their imagination quietly, becoming part of how they understood their place in the world. When they read about explorers, merchants, and administrators, it seemed like a chain of noble efforts stretching back generations. Every new lesson built on the last. Every recited fact reinforced the belief that the empire was both justified and necessary. The effect reached far beyond the schoolroom. These lessons shaped how ordinary Britons understood global events. When uprisings occurred overseas or political debates took place in Parliament, many citizens interpreted them through the lens formed in childhood. They believed that British presence brought improvement. They imagined distant territories as parts of a shared identity rather than contested spaces. The narrative they learned as children became the foundation for beliefs they carried into adulthood. Cultural symbols supported this message. Paintings of colonial landscapes hung in public buildings. Stories of naval victories and administrative triumphs appeared in readers designed for younger audiences. Even games and puzzles echoed imperial geography, encouraging children to trace sea routes and recognize port cities. The empire became familiar. It felt like a place one knew, even if one never saw it. Teachers played an important role in maintaining the narrative. They presented information with confidence, as though every detail were beyond dispute. Their authority made the story feel complete. Children rarely asked what life was like in these territories or what those who lived there thought about British rule. The lessons did not invite such questions. The structure of the classroom, with its rows of desks and careful instruction, created the impression that knowledge flowed in one direction. Yet beneath this calm surface, the world was not so simple. Debates took place in Parliament. Resistance simmered in territories that did not see British rule as benevolent. Economic pressures shaped decisions far more than moral guidance. But in the classroom, these truths remained outside the door. The map showed borders, not consequences. Still, the image held power. The children who learned from those maps grew up to shape the world they had been taught to imagine. Some became clerks in shipping offices. Others worked as soldiers, sailors, teachers, or journalists. Their understanding of empire was rooted in the red lines and guided lessons of their youth. They carried with them the belief that Britannia's role overseas was defined by responsibility rather than ambition. It was a belief built not out of deception, but out of omission. Between 1830 and 1870, the classroom became one of the most influential institutions of empire. Not through direct command, but through subtle shaping of perception. The map on the wall created a sense of belonging to something vast. The schoolbook framed expansion as a shared enterprise. The teacher's voice carried the weight of certainty. It was an education in geography, but also in identity. By the end of this period, the children who had traced those red shapes across continents had grown older. Where the empire seemed as familiar as home. Because they had been taught its story before they had ever experienced it. The classroom had created a foundation of belief that would shape public opinion for decades. The story of the empire was not only written in parliaments and ports. It was written in chalk, in ink, and in memory. In those schoolrooms, the lines on the map were not just borders. They were the boundaries of imagination. Victorian celebrations and ceremonies 1870 to 1901. In the final decades of the 19th century, Britain lived in a world shaped by ceremony. Between 1870 and 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria reached its symbolic height, and across the empire, celebrations became part of daily life. These were not just events. They were performances of identity. Parades, jubilees, exhibitions, and fairs transformed streets into stages and citizens into participants. Through music, banners, and spectacle, the empire presented itself not only as a political power, but as a cultural reality. In busy city centers, crowds gathered beneath fluttering flags. Musicians played brass marches that echoed against stone buildings. Public squares filled with families who came to see soldiers, dignitaries, and royal representatives process past with polished boots and gleaming medals. For many, these scenes felt like proof that the world recognized Britain as a force of progress and authority. The empire was not distant. It was present. It was visible. It was something ordinary people could stand beside and cheer for. Grand exhibitions became some of the most influential celebrations of the era. Inside, exhibits from distant territories stood beside industrial marvels and commercial innovations. Visitors moved from one display to another, overwhelmed by the sense of scale. Textiles from South Asia, carvings from Africa, and artworks from the Pacific were arranged to appear as trophies of connection. The intent was not only to educate, but to impress. The exhibitions created the impression that the empire brought the world together under a single crown. For many attendees, the exhibitions offered a glimpse into places they would never see. They looked upon unfamiliar objects without understanding the histories behind them. They accepted the arrangement of displays as representation rather than interpretation. Without knowing it, they absorbed a narrative that suggested the empire existed to gather, protect, and uplift. The goods on display acted as symbols. They were meant to show harmony, not conflict. Exchange, not disruption. Progress, not complexity. Public celebrations reinforced this message. Jubilee events honored Queen Victoria's long reign. And inspired loyalty that blended personal admiration with national identity. Streets filled with lanterns and bunting. Children practiced songs that praised monarch and country. Journalists reported with admiration, describing the atmosphere as unified and joyful. These celebrations became emotional anchors for the empire. They offered a sense of belonging that discouraged criticism and encouraged pride. The spectacle felt unforgettable. And in that feeling, the narrative took root. Royal processions deepened this sense of connection. When carriages rolled through crowded avenues, thousands lined the streets to witness the moment. Some waved small flags. Others reached forward hoping to catch a glimpse. The ceremonial presence of the monarchy suggested continuity. It implied that the empire was not just strong, but enduring. It turned power into ritual, and ritual into reassurance. The experience of watching, of standing among the crowd, created memory. Memory, in turn, became belief. Fairs and markets added another layer to the narrative. Vendors sold objects described as exotic, rare, or authentic, brought from distant parts of the empire. These items, however ordinary in origin, took on symbolic value. They became proof that the empire reached beyond the horizon. In such moments, the empire became personal. It lived in homes as souvenirs, reminders of participation in something larger. Yet beneath the spectacle was a reality not visible to the crowds. They did not show the inequality that shaped life in many colonies. They did not show the debates, the dissent, or the conflicts that accompanied governance. They did not show the differing perspectives of the people who lived under British rule. The narrative of harmony silenced the voices that did not fit the image. What remained was a polished reflection, not a clear mirror. This gap between spectacle and reality gave the celebrations their power. Most attendees did not travel to other continents. They did not witness administration, negotiation, or unrest firsthand. Their understanding came from what they saw in the streets and read in the newspapers. Ceremonies, intentionally or not, became lessons. They taught that the empire represented improvement. They taught that expansion meant connection. They taught that royal authority ensured order. In these lessons, the empire was translated into feeling. As the century approached its end, the celebrations grew more elaborate. Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 illustrated this perfectly. The event was framed as proof that the empire stood united across oceans and borders. Telegrams from foreign officials, military detachments from overseas, and representatives from across the empire contributed to the image of unity. Crowds heard speeches that described the empire as a partnership rather than a hierarchy. The ceremony did not describe the full truth, but it shaped the memory that would outlast the moment. Even those who questioned imperial policy felt the pull of the spectacle. The emotional force of celebration made criticism difficult. To stand apart from the crowd felt like standing against the nation. The ceremonies encouraged confidence at a time when the world was changing rapidly. Industrialization, social reform, and international competition created uncertainty. The Empiria's celebrations served as answers to that uncertainty. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the era of celebration did not end immediately, but it entered a new phase. The ritual unity that had defined the final decades of her reign shifted. Without her figure at its center, the narrative had to find new ways to sustain itself. The ceremonies of the late Victorian period became benchmarks in memory rather than living events. They remained, but now as history rather than identity. Between 1870 and 1901, celebrations and ceremonies turned the empire into something people could see, hear, and believe in. Through spectacle, they created emotion. Through emotion, they created loyalty. They made the empire feel inevitable. But feeling is not the same as truth. The spectacle did not define the world. It defined how the world was imagined. In that imagination, the empire found its greatest audience. Between 1880 and 1914, journalism became one of the most influential forces shaping public opinion in Britain. Newspapers acted as a bridge between the island and the expanding empire, connecting readers to events unfolding across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The press transformed distant developments into familiar headlines. It reported victories and exploration with confidence. It highlighted progress and prosperity. It rarely focused on failure. It almost never acknowledged the human cost. Through selective storytelling, newspapers guided how millions understood the wider world. Each morning, readers unfolded papers filled with dispatches from foreign ports and territories under British administration. Reports were written with a tone of authority, as though the events described were precise reflections of reality. In truth, they were heavily shaped by perspective. Stories framed expansion as necessary, orderly, and strategic. Resistance was described as disorder or instability. When local leaders disagreed with British involvement, they were depicted as obstacles rather than participants in their own history. The framing mattered as much as the facts. It taught readers how to interpret events long before they developed their own opinions. Most Britons trusted what they read. They had little access to alternative sources. Foreign news arrived filtered through journalists, editors, officials, and cables that passed through government lines. The public believed they were receiving a complete account. Instead, they were being given a version of events that emphasized strength and legitimacy. A world that was complex appeared simple. A process that was contested appeared inevitable. Through repetition, selective coverage began to feel like truth. In newsrooms, editors made choices about which stories deserved space. Reports that aligned with national goals often filled the front pages. Stories that questioned policy were minimized or omitted. Articles described new territories gained through treaty or occupation as achievements. Expedition reports emphasized bravery and discovery. Local perspectives appeared rarely or not at all. Readers learned about distant landscapes without learning about the people who lived there. They learned about negotiations without learning who had been pressured to sign them. Silence became a tool as powerful as print. Maps accompanied many articles. They displayed borders drawn across continents as though they had always existed. Lines created by European governments in distant conference rooms appeared on the page with an air of permanence. Shaded areas represented spheres of influence. These visual cues shaped understanding before even a sentence was read. The map suggested logic and structure. The text supported the image. Together, they gave the impression that global expansion was thoughtful, planned, and beneficial. The reader accepted the narrative before examining its foundation. In this era, newspapers also fueled competition. Rival empires were described in contrasting tones. France and Germany appeared as challengers on the horizon. Russia loomed as a potential threat in Asia. This sense of rivalry encouraged the belief that Britain had to act to maintain its position. Expansion became a defensive measure rather than an assertive one. The press repeated this idea until it became a shared assumption. Readers internalized the notion that global involvement protected the homeland, even when events had little connection to security. Journalists who traveled abroad often faced practical limits. Communication systems were slow. Information was filtered through local intermediaries and colonial offices. As a result, their reports relied on the perspectives of those already in power. Administrators and officials shaped the narrative before it reached print. Even without intentional manipulation, the structure of information ensured that certain voices defined the story. Ordinary Britons never heard the voices of farmers, traders, diplomats, or leaders from the regions being described. They heard only the interpretation of those managing the expansion. At home, the audience rarely questioned the omissions. Newspapers were part of daily routine. People read them in train stations, offices, homes, and factories. The paper became a measure of reality. If it did not, people assumed it was not important. Readers did not see what had been left out. Subjects that required nuance appeared settled. Issues that deserved debate appeared decided. Public opinion formed around the contours of what the news allowed people to see. Missing context created unintended certainty. Readers did not see what had been left out. Subjects that required nuance appeared settled. Issues that deserved debate appeared decided. Public opinion formed around the contours of what the news allowed people to see. At home, the audience rarely questioned the omissions. By the turn of the century, journalism had become inseparable from imperial identity. Reports from abroad offered reassurance that the empire was stable, prosperous, and respected. When challenges arose, the news framed them as temporary or misguided. Resistance was portrayed as confusion rather than strategy. The possibility that local people acted with purpose and reason rarely reached the page. Without contradictory information, the public assumed the narrative was accurate. Belief replaced inquiry. This dynamic influenced politics. Parliament understood that newspapers shaped public perception. Politicians timed announcements to align with favorable headlines. Leaders referenced press sentiment in speeches. In this feedback loop, journalism did not simply reflect public opinion. It helped create it. The press guided the boundaries of acceptable debate. Ideas that strayed too far from the mainstream narrative struggled to gain attention or legitimacy. In this way, journalism acted as both mirror and architect of belief. During these decades, some voices attempted to challenge dominant narratives. Letters to editors occasionally questioned policy. Rare reports described the strain placed on local systems. However, these accounts reached far fewer readers than the prevailing stories of progress and justification. Critique existed, but the larger framework of coverage made it easy to dismiss. The dominant tone of confidence overwhelmed uncertainty. Looking back, the influence of journalism from 1880 to 1914 reveals how information can guide a nation toward conclusions without force or instruction. It shows how public opinion can be shaped not only by what is said, but by what is left unsaid. For many Britons, the empire felt familiar long before they understood its complexity. They believed they were being told the truth, even when important truths were missing. Newspapers connected them to the world, but they also defined the limits of what they were allowed to see. This era demonstrates that the story of empire was not written only in policy or on maps. It was written in sentences printed each morning. It was shaped in the silence between the lines. When the First World War began in 1914, many Britons still imagined the empire as a distant structure. It was a set of borders drawn on maps, territories shaded in color, and symbols of power that stretched across oceans. But as the war progressed, that distant image changed. The empire no longer seemed far away. It arrived in city streets, in stations crowded with uniforms. And in the sight of soldiers marching side by side who came from places most Britons had only read about. The war forced the nation to witness the empire not as an idea, but as a living reality. Millions of troops came from beyond Britannia's shores. From India, Africa, Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean, they traveled thousands of miles to fight on unfamiliar soil. Columns of soldiers moved through London, Edinburgh, and Liverpool on their way to the front. For some, it was the first moment they understood the scale of the empire in human terms. These were not distant subjects. These were individuals with their own courage, expectations, and sacrifices. On the Western Front, colonial forces fought beside British regiments. They held the same trenches, endured the same bombardments, and faced the same uncertainty. In France and Belgium, they encountered landscapes torn apart by artillery. They crossed ruined villages where walls stood like broken teeth against grey skies. In deserts and mountain passes beyond Europe, others fought in campaigns that demanded endurance as much as weaponry. Across these battlefields, the empire no longer operated through governors or trade agreements. It lived through the footsteps of those who served. At home, newspapers began to acknowledge this reality. They printed stories of bravery from regiments whose names were unfamiliar to many readers. They described soldiers who spoke different languages, practiced different traditions, and came from climates far removed from European winters. These reports changed the public's understanding of who defended Britain. The empire became a shared responsibility rather than a distant privilege. The idea of unity began to feel both inspiring and complicated. Propaganda posters celebrated this unity. They showed soldiers of multiple backgrounds standing together beneath the same banners. They encouraged the belief that the empire was a family defending the principle of freedom. For many Britons, these images created pride. They suggested that a vast network of nations stood behind the war effort. But they also sparked new questions. If the empire asked for loyalty, should it not also offer respect? As letters returned from the front, the emotional distance between Britain and its empire shrank. Families read accounts of companionship forged across cultural divides. Soldiers wrote of sharing rations with men from faraway homelands. Of learning to pronounce unfamiliar names, of realizing that sacrifice did not belong to one nation alone. This recognition changed the way some people viewed the structure of imperial authority. Service created expectations that could not be easily dismissed. In cities across Britain, the sight of wounded veterans from overseas reminded citizens of this shared cost. Hospitals treated men who had never seen snow before the battlefield, and who now faced recovery far away from the climates and communities that shaped them. Even in these moments, the public saw the empire not as a line on a map but as a network of human experiences intertwined by war. That awareness did not vanish when the guns fell silent. Still, not everyone saw the war the same way. Some clung to older narratives of empire as a one-sided relationship of guidance and authority. They believed the presence of overseas troops on British streets proved the strength of imperial loyalty rather than mutual obligation. Others noticed disparities. They asked why opportunities for advancement were uneven. They wondered why respect was not given in equal measure to those who had risked their lives. The war did not resolve these conflicts. It revealed them. By 1917, with the conflict deepening, the tension between loyalty and expectation grew stronger. In some colonies, citizens began to speak openly about political reform. They questioned how long promises of fairness could be delayed. In Britain, new discussions emerged among civilians, clergy, and politicians about the responsibilities that came with imperial unity. Conversations that had once remained private reached the public sphere. The narrative had changed. The empire was no longer viewed as simply powerful. It was now accountable. When the war ended in 1918, crowds filled the streets to celebrate. Church bells rang, and flags fluttered from windows. But beneath the celebration lay a shift in understanding. Victory had come at a cost shared by millions from every corner of the empire. The war had proven that the empire could not function through distance and assumption. That loyalty created expectations for recognition, equality, and voice. In the years that followed, those expectations would grow louder. Veterans returned to their homelands with memories of trenches and battlefields where they had fought as equals. They returned with a new sense of identity and a new awareness of their place in world affairs. Their experiences began to influence movements for reform and self-representation. The narrative of empire could no longer remain unchanged. From 1914 to 1918, the war reshaped the story Britain told about itself. It exposed both the strength of unity and the limits of assumption. It showed that the empire was not merely territory, but humanity. It revealed that sacrifice demanded acknowledgement. It proved that loyalty could not be expected without fairness. War had changed the narrative. And once changed, it could not return to what it had been before. The Age of Doubt 1919 to 1939. When the First World War ended in 1918, Britain emerged victorious but unsettled. The empire still stretched across continents, but the foundations beneath it had shifted. Soldiers returned with new expectations. Colonies remembered promises made during the fighting. Newspapers struggled to maintain the confident voice they once used to describe imperial strength. Across the world, the decades that followed marked the beginning of an age of doubt. In the early 1920s, news from overseas grew harder to ignore. Movements in India, Egypt, Kenya, and other territories began appearing in British headlines. These were not stories of expansion, but of negotiation, protest, and political pressure. A new rhythm of reporting formed. Demonstrations in Indian cities. Constitutional debates in Egypt. Public meetings in Kenya. Talks of autonomy in Ireland. Each story, even when softened or shortened, revealed something the old imperial narrative had not prepared readers to see. The empire was being questioned from within. For decades, newspapers had presented distant territories as stable under British authority, but now their pages carried a different tone. Reports described unrest, petitions for reform, and delegations traveling to London to demand change. Even when censorship softened the language, the meaning remained unavoidable. The empire was no longer accepted without discussion. It had entered the public conversation. Ordinary Britons, many of whom had never thought deeply about empire, faced an uncomfortable realization. Some still saw imperial rule as a benefit to the territories. Others began to wonder if holding such vast power was a responsibility too great to maintain. The certainty that once defined the imperial story began to fray. Returning veterans added to the atmosphere of doubt. They had fought beside colonial soldiers who had shown loyalty and bravery. They remembered shared struggle and sacrifice. Seeing those same territories now demanding a voice raised questions that newspapers could not fully answer. If the empire had been a partnership during war, why was it treated differently in peace? Why did loyalty not lead to equality? By the late 1920s, the press could no longer dismiss these questions as isolated incidents. They appeared too often, from too many places. Editorials debated the future. Some insisted that the empire must adapt or lose relevance. Others argued that change would weaken Britain. The public was left between these positions, unsure which direction history was moving. At the same time, global shifts influenced the conversation. Economic pressure after the Great Depression forced Britain to reconsider the cost of maintaining distant territories. Trade networks faltered. Industries struggled. The empire, once seen as a source of wealth, now appeared to some as a burden requiring constant defense and administration. The idea of imperial pride met the reality of economic limitation. In the colonies, more voices found their way into the press. Activists, lawyers, and writers made arguments in letters, conferences, and newspapers of their own. They spoke of representation, dignity, and freedom. These ideas, once easy to dismiss, now traveled across borders with speed. Radio broadcasts and telegraph cables turned resistance into a global conversation. The British public, accustomed to stories of imperial certainty, now saw a world changing in real time. For many, the shift was disorienting. The empire had once been a symbol of progress and identity. Now it was something to be defended, justified, or explained. People who had grown up believing in the empire as a natural order had to confront a new truth. It was not inevitable. It was not eternal. It could be challenged. The age of doubt had arrived. Yet even as uncertainty spread, pride did not disappear. Some newspapers continued to emphasize unity and cooperation. They highlighted modern infrastructure, economic partnerships, and cultural exchange. They described gradual reform as evidence that the empire remained a positive force. These voices argued that change could come without surrendering the imperial structure. But they were no longer the only voices. In working-class neighborhoods, the question of empire appeared in practical terms. If resources flowed outward to maintain distant control, what would be left for those struggling at home? If reforms in the colonies required political attention, what did that mean for domestic needs? The empire, once seen as a source of strength, now competed with the realities of daily life. In elite circles, the debate took a different form. Some leaders believed that the empire must tighten its hold to preserve influence. Others imagined a future built on cooperation rather than control. No consensus emerged. By the 1930s, the uncertainty hardened into a permanent feature of public life. The imperial story was still told, but no longer with the confidence of past decades. It was a story that needed justification. Every headline about protest or negotiation required explanation. Every policy decision risked strengthening doubt. Even celebrations of imperial unity carried an undertone of concern. Readers began to recognize that the story of empire was no longer rising. It was balancing. As another war loomed on the horizon, the questions remained unresolved. Was the empire still a source of pride? Or had it become a responsibility that shaped Britain's destiny more than it supported it? The answer depended on who was asked. For some, imperial identity remained a foundation of national strength. For others, it had become a chain holding the nation to its past. Between 1919 and 1939, the empire entered an era without certainty. The world had changed. And the story that once defined Britain changed with it. The age of doubt did not end the empire. But it ended the belief that the empire did not need to change. Between 1939 and 1947, the world witnessed the collapse of an idea that had shaped British identity for generations. The empire had long presented itself as permanent, stable, and unassailable. It stood like a pillar in the imagination, taught through textbooks, echoed in speeches, and reinforced in newspapers. But war has a way of demanding truth. As the Second World War spread across continents, the image of imperial certainty began to shift. What followed was not simply a military struggle. It was a transformation in belief. At the start of the conflict, many assumed the empire would weather the storm as it always had. The Royal Navy guarded the seas. Overseas garrisons stood ready. The public believed that distance and power would offer protection. Yet the global reach of the war meant that no territory was beyond danger. Battles stretched from Europe to North Africa to Asia, and the empire found itself defending not just land, but reputation. Confidence remained, but it was no longer effortless. Beneath the surface, people sensed the scale of the challenge. The turning point came in 1942. Singapore, often described as an impregnable fortress, fell after a rapid and devastating campaign. News of the defeat moved across the empire like a shockwave. For decades, Singapore had been held up as proof that Britain could not be pushed back. Its fall revealed something that had rarely been acknowledged. The empire was vulnerable. The myth of guaranteed strength cracked. For millions of subjects across Asia, this moment changed how the future looked. The idea that British rule would stretch on indefinitely no longer felt certain. In Britain, the reaction was quiet but profound. Newspapers still spoke of determination, but the tone shifted. Reports acknowledged hardship, retreat, and recovery rather than destiny. The empire, once imagined as a shield, now needed defense. The pride of the past met the reality of the present, and they no longer fully aligned. Meanwhile, voices across the empire grew stronger. The war had drawn soldiers, workers, and resources from colonies around the globe. Millions served in uniform, fighting in deserts, jungles, cities, and oceans. They returned home with new expectations. They had fought beside British troops, faced equal danger, and shouldered equal sacrifice. Now they asked if equality would continue in peace. Political movements gained confidence. Calls for independence became demands instead of requests. The question was no longer whether change would come, but when. Britain faced its own hardships. Cities bore the marks of bombing. Resources were stretched thin. The cost of maintaining the empire became harder to justify, especially when the home front needed rebuilding. The war did not end the empire in a single moment, but it revealed the limits of control. Power that once radiated outward now contended with pressure from every direction. By 1945, the war was over, but the empire was not the same. Triumph in Europe did not erase defeats in Asia. Victory did not restore the old certainty. People looked at the world and saw new global powers rising, new political realities forming, and a future that would not revolve around imperial rule. Conversations in Britain reflected this shift. Some spoke of preserving what remained. Others accepted that change was inevitable. The unshakable pillars of empire now seemed like structures of a fading era. 2 years later, in 1947, India achieved independence. The moment symbolized more than a constant, it signaled the end of an age. For those who had grown up with maps marked in red, this was a step into unfamiliar territory. Yet it did not arrive with chaos. It arrived with recognition. The belief in inevitability had already disappeared. The fall of Singapore had broken the illusion. The war had revealed the cost of empire. Decolonization was no longer a distant idea. It was the present. In living rooms across Britain, families read the news and understood that the world had turned a page. The empire still existed, but it no longer defined the future. The narrative of superiority and permanence had dissolved. What remained was a sense of transition. A recognition that history was moving on, with or without the structures that had once stood at its center. This period did not end with a dramatic collapse. It ended with realization. The collapse of certainty was not a single moment in time, but a gradual shift in belief. Step by step, the world after 1947 was not a world without Britain, but a world no longer shaped by the unquestioned presence of British rule. The story had changed. The age of empire had been built on confidence. The years between 1939 and 1947 replaced that confidence with reflection. The myth of invincibility gave way to the truth of limitation. And in that recognition, a new chapter began. Shaped not by the memory of what once seemed unbreakable, but by the reality of what came after. Between 1947 and 1950, Britain entered a period defined not by conquest or expansion, but by memory and reconsideration. The empire that had once been described as eternal was dissolving. And the narratives that had once supported it no longer held the same power. With India gaining independence in 1947 and others soon to follow, the conversation shifted from how the empire would grow to what it had meant. It unfolded in homes, classrooms, newsrooms, and political halls. Carried forward by individuals coming to terms with a world that was reshaping itself. Across the country, ordinary people encountered this transition through news reports and radio broadcasts. That sounded different from the confident headlines of earlier decades. Words like destiny and duty appeared less frequently. In their place were reflections on partnership, transition, and responsibility. Listeners who had grown up surrounded by the assurances of imperial achievement now heard discussions that recognized complexity. The tone of the press no longer insisted. It asked. It suggested. It wondered. A generation that had been raised to see the empire as a pillar of identity now questioned what lay beneath its foundation. In the privacy of living rooms, families spoke about the empire in ways they never had before. Some remembered past decades with pride, recalling celebrations, military victories, or distant postings that had felt like part of something larger. Others asked what had been done in their name. They wondered what could not be seen behind decades of ceremonies, exhibitions, and speeches. The end of rule in India encouraged these questions. It reminded many that history was still happening, not just written. Children who had once studied maps colored in red now listened as their teachers explained why those maps were changing. Veterans and civil servants who had lived abroad returned to Britain with stories that did not always match the narratives of newspapers or schoolbooks. They carried memories of cooperation, hardship, tension, and adaptation. Some described friendships that had endured across cultural and national boundaries. Others remembered the strain that came from governing distant territories. Their voices added dimension to a subject that had once been presented as simple. In their accounts, empire became a mixture of achievement and error, progress and misunderstanding, legacy and consequence. Parliament debated the meaning of this new era. Politicians discussed the responsibilities Britain owed to former colonies. And the question of how to remain connected without claiming authority. Some argued that the empire had been a stabilizing force, and that its departure would leave a void. Others believed the time had come to build a future without imperial claims. These discussions did not resolve easily. But they signaled that the age of assumption had ended. The language of governance changed. Words like guidance and improvement were replaced with negotiation and independence. Education shifted as well. New textbooks arrived in schools, presenting the empire not as a single, unified story, but as a series of events seen from different viewpoints. Students encountered names and places that had once appeared only as distant locations on a map. They learned that history did not belong to a single perspective, and that every account was shaped by who wrote it and why. These lessons marked a departure from the certainty of earlier generations. They showed that identity could be built without claiming superiority, and that understanding required more than pride. In public parks and city squares, monuments that once seemed eternal took on new meaning. Statues that had symbolized imperial authority became reminders of a world now gone. Some citizens still saw them as tributes to national strength. Others saw them as echoes of a past that required examination. The stones did not move, but the interpretations did. Memory changed the landscape more than time. Outside of Britain, newly independent nations began constructing their own futures. Some leaders chose cooperation, forming ties with Britain through trade or diplomacy. Others distanced themselves, seeking identities free from historical influence. Britain watched as the world that had once been described as connected through a single crown reorganized into a network of independent voices. For many, this shift brought uncertainty. For others, it brought clarity. By 1950, the emotional distance between Britain and its imperial identity had widened. The empire was no longer a present reality. It was a subject. Something to be studied, discussed, and eventually judged. Newspapers published retrospectives rather than celebrations. Radio broadcasts described anniversaries of independence rather than coronations of new territories. The empire now stood not at the edge of tomorrow, but at the center of yesterday. Reflection did not erase what had happened. It illuminated it. In classrooms, museums, and discussions around dinner tables, people acknowledged that the legacy of empire was neither singular nor easy to define. It carried achievements alongside harm, innovation alongside disruption. It had built connections across continents, but also divisions. For the first time, many Britons accepted that two ideas could exist at once. Pride and regret. Accomplishment and consequence. Identity and responsibility. By the end of the decade, the empire had become memory. Not a myth, not a certainty, but a subject of history. The narrative that once spoke with authority now invited interpretation. The past no longer provided direction. It provided questions. And those questions would shape the future as surely as conquest had shaped the past. In this era of reflection, Britain did not lose itself. It confronted itself. And in doing so, it began the long process of understanding what its legacy truly meant. Thank you for joining this journey through time. The views of ordinary Britons remind us that history is not only shaped by leaders and empires, but by the beliefs of everyday people. They saw glory, they saw fear, they saw pride, and eventually they saw change. Understanding how they viewed empire helps us see how stories create nations, and how nations create stories in return. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning from the past.